Chapter 23, Part 2. On the outer rim of the solar system, where the planets roll, lax, dark and lifeless, appeared 9 small white points of light, which were definitely not registered upon any directory of the heavens. They moved upon a level trajectory and travelled at what appeared to be an even and leisurely pace. Given the vast distances which they were covering during the course of each single second, however, this was obviously far from being the case. Upon the flight deck of the leading Syrian man-o'-war, the starship Sundra stood the captain, one Lombard, Mager by name, known to some as Lord of 1,000 Suns, Viceroy of the Galactic Empire, and Crown Prince of Sirius. He was a man of average height, with high cheekbones and a slightly tanned complexion. He bore an uncanny resemblance to a young Jack Palance, and even when travelling through the outer reaches of the cosmic infinite, smelt strongly of creosote.
"Set a course for home,"
he said, affecting a noble stance and pointing proudly into space.
"We have conquered the galaxy, and now return in triumph to our homeworld. Ceres, here we come."
The navigator, who bore a striking resemblance to his captain, but whose rank merited a far less heavily braided uniform and fewer campaign ribbons, tapped out a series of instructions into a console of advanced design.
"Goodness me,"
said he, as the computer guidance system flashed up an unexpected reply to his instructions upon a 3-dimensional screen.
"Now there's a funny thing."
Lombard Omega leaned over his shoulder and squinted into the glowing display of 9 orbiting worlds.
"Where's the fragging planet gone?"
he asked.
140,
shouted the adjudicator, oblivious to what was going on at the outer edge of the solar system.
"The Horseman needs 97.
"If they aren't cheating," said Pooley, "they are playing a blinder of a game."
"Oh, they're cheating all right," O'Malley replied, "although I don't think the professor's worked out quite how yet."
In truth, the professor had not. He had watched young Jack like a hawk, and was certain that he observed no hint of trickery. Surely the horseman could not be winning by skill alone. Billy Banjoed Breton, the horseman's inebriate reserve, was suddenly up on the hockey. The very idea of a team fielding reserve in a championship match was totally unheard of, the role of reserve being by tradition filled by the pub's resident drunk, who acted more as mascot and comedy relief than player. A rumble of disbelief and suspicion rolled through the crowd. 2 of the horsemen's team pointed Billy in the direction of the board.
"Over there," they said.
Billy aimed his dart flight first.
"Young Jack's having a pop at the professor," said O'Malley. "He's definitely working some kind of flanker."
A look of perplexity had crossed Professor Slocum's face. He cast about for a reason, but none was forthcoming. A gentle tap at his elbow suddenly marshalled his thoughts.
"There is one outside and one by the machine," said
Edgar Allan Poe. Professor Slocum nodded.
"May I ask the purpose of the game?" "It's a challenge match between the history known as the 4 Horsemen and our own beloved Flying Swan," Professor Slocum replied telepathically. "Then may I ask you to allow your opponents to have their missiles guided by a spirit form?"
A smile broke out upon Professor Slocum's face, which did not go unnoticed by John O'Malley.
"I sussed it," said John.
Professor Slocum leant close to the ear of young Jack.
"Have you ever heard me recite the rite of exorcism?" he asked. "I have it down to something of a fine art."
Young Jack cast the old man the kind of look which could deflower virgins and cause babies to fill their nappies.
"All right," said he, "we will play it straight. That you will never do, but simply chalk that one up and be advised."
47, bawled the adjudicator, who was growing hoarse.
"Unlucky,"
said Professor Slocum.
"The Swan needs 68.
The Swan got it with little difficulty. Lombard Omega ran up and down the flight deck, peering through the plexiglass portholes and waving his fists in the air.
"Where's it gone?" he ranted at intervals. "Where's it gone?"
His navigator punched all he could into the console and shrugged repeatedly.
"It just isn't there," he said. "It's gone. Kaput. Finite. Gone. It must be there. It was there when we left it."
The navigator covered his ears to the Syrian obscenities.
"It honestly isn't now," he said. "There is a lot of debris about, though, a veritable asteroid belt. You find something, and find it quick. growled his commanding officer, or you go down to the boog chute into hyperspace. The navigator bashed away at the console like a mad thing. There's no trace, he whispered despairingly. The entire system's dead. He tapped at the macroscopic intensifier powered by the transperambulation of pseudo-cosmic antimatter. Oh, no, it isn't. Look, there's a signal. Lombard was at his side in an instant. Bring it up then, you Wally. Bring the frogging thing up. The navigator enlarged the image upon a three-dimensional screen. It's on planet Earth, he said. A triangulation and a lay image. The constellation of the plough, surely. And look there. Lombard looked there. 1/3 up from the baseline of the triangulation. A beacon transmitting a signal. The coordinates of an approach run. That's where they are. Lombard stroked his Hollywood chin. The blessed rods have moved over closer to the sun. Wise move. Wise merging move. Take us in then. Earth full steam ahead. Lock into autopilot. The beacon will guide us in. Anybody got a roll-up?
O'Malley rolled a cigarette as the professor joined them at the table. You found them out then? He asked between licks.
I don't think we've entirely got the better of him, the old man replied. He's a trick or two up his sleeve yet, I believe.
I won't ask what that one turned out to be. This one lead by 1-0, croaked the adjudicator. Second game on, Osman to throw. As this was a championship match by local rules, the losing team threw first. Young Jack ran his forked tongue about the tip of his dart.
Straight and true this time, Professor,
quoth he.
With the corner up,
the old man replied. Young Jack flung his darts in such rapid succession that they were nothing more than a triple blur. They each struck the board straight and true within the wide boundaries of the treble 20, which was nothing more or less than anybody had expected. The grinning demonologist strode to the board and tore out his darts with a vengeance. I should very much like to see the fellow miss once in a while, Pooley told the professor, just to give the impression that he isn't infallible. Professor Slocum whispered another Latin phrase, and young Jack knocked his pint of mild into his father's lap. Thank you, said Jim. I appreciated that. Archie Karachi was throwing for the Swan. Dressed this evening in a stunning caftan, oblivious to the damage wrought upon his kitchen, he was definitely on form. Archie had a most unique manner of play. As a singles man, his technique brought a tear to the eye of many a seasoned player. Scorning the beloved treble 20, he went instead for bizarre combinations, which generally had the chalksman in a panic of fingers and thumbs. On a good night, with luck at his elbow, he could tear away an apparent 200 in 3 throws. Even when chalked up, this still had his opponents believing that he'd thrown his shots away. Tonight he threw a stunning combination, which had the appearance of being a treble 19, a double 13 and a bullseye, though it's hard to be certain. The degree of mental arithmetic involved in computing the final total was well beyond the man on the chalks and most of the patrons present. When the 501 was scratched out and 257 appeared in its place, nobody thought to argue.
I admire that, said Professor Slocum. It is a form of negative psychology. I will swear that if the score does not come up in multiples of 20, nobody can work it out.
I can, said O'Malley, but he is on our side.
I can't, said Pooley. He pulls his darts out so quickly I couldn't even see what he scored.
Ah, said O'Malley, there's a man I like to watch. The Four Horsemen's most extraordinary player had to be the man Kelly. He was by no means a great dartsman, but for sheer entertainment value he stood alone. It must be understood that the wondrous scores previously recorded are not entirely typical of the play as a whole, and that not each member of the team was a specialist in his field. The high and impossible scores were the preserve of the very few and finest. Amongst each team, the Swan and the Horseman being no exception, there were also able players, hard triers, and what might be accurately described as the downright desperate. The man Kelly was one of the latter. When he flung a dart, it was very much a case of stand aside, lads, and women and children first. The man Kelly was more a fast bowler than a darts player. The man Kelly bowled a first dart. It wasn't a bad one, and it plunged wholeheartedly into the general direction of the board. Somewhere, however, during the course of its journey, the lone projectile suddenly remembered that it had pressing business elsewhere. The man Kelly's dart was never seen again. A little off centre, the player asked his fuming and speechless captain. His second throw was a classic in every sense of the word. Glancing off the board with the sound of a ricocheting rule bullet, it tore back into the assembled crowd, scattering friend and foe alike, and striking home through the lobe of all Pete's right ear. The crowd engulfed the ancient to offer assistance.
"Don't touch it!" bellowed the old one. "By God, it's completely cured the rheumatism in my left kneecap."
Lombard Omega scrutinised the instrument panel and swore between his teeth.
"I can't see this," he said at length. "This does not make any flying sense. I mean, be reasonable. Our good word Ceres cannot just vanish away like plash down a snarf pit in the twinkling of a blanching trumpet."
The navigator whispered a silent prayer to his chosen deity. It was an honour to serve upon the flagship of the Syrian battle fleet, but it was a hard thing indeed to suffer the constant stream of obscenity which poured from his commander's mouth.
"We have been away for a very long time," he ventured. "More than 6,000 years, Earth time." "Earth time? Blood-searching time? What is blood-searching Earth time when it's at home to a great cruise blood?" "Well, as a target world, it must be considered to be standard solar time."
Lombard Omega spat on the platinum-coated deck and ground the spittle in with a fiberglass heel.
"This doesn't half get my dander up," said he.
Standard solar time was approaching 10:15 of the PM clock, and the four horsemen in the Flying Swan now stood even at 2 games all, and 1 to play for the shield. Tension, which had been reaching to the proverbial breaking point, had now passed far beyond that, and chaos, panic and desperation had taken its place. O'Malley had ground 7 biros into oblivion, and his books now resembled some nightmare of Einsteinian cross-calculation.
"I sincerely believe that the ultimate secrets of the universe might well be found within this book," said Pooley, leafing over the heavily thumbed pages. For his outspokenness, he received a blow to the skull which sent him reeling. O'Malley was at present in no mood for the snappy rejoinder.
"For God's sake, get another round in," said Professor Slocum.
O'Malley left the table. "Forgive me, if you will," said Pooley, when the Irishman was engaged in pummelling his way through the crowd towards the bar. "But do you remember that we are under imminent threat of annihilation by these lads from Ceres? I mean, we are still taking it seriously, aren't we?"
Professor Slocum patted Pooley's arm.
"Good show," he said. "I understand your concern. It's always easy to surround oneself with what is safe and comfortable, and to ignore the outre threats which lurk upon the borderline. Please be assured that we have done everything that can be done."
"Sorry," said Jim, "but strange as it may seem, I do get a little anxious once in a while."
"Ladies and ladies and gentlemen," croaked the adjudicator in a strangled voice, "the end is near and we face the final curtain."
There was some boos and a few cheers.
"The last match is to play. It is decided for the challenge shield. And our last was science. Whilst the 2 teams prepare themselves."
A respectful hush fell upon the Swan. Even the boy Rathbone ceased his game. However, this was not through his being any respecter of darts tournaments, but rather that his last 2 bob bit had run out, and he was forced up to the bar for more change.
"It is the play-off. 5 and 1 to gain. By the toss, first darts the horsemen. Good luck to all and game on."
Professor Slocum's eyes swung towards the horsemen's team. Something strange seemed to have occurred within their ranks. Old Jack had declined to take his darts and sat sullenly in his wheelchair. The man Kelly was nowhere to be seen, and the other disembodied members of the team had withdrawn to their places of perpetual night and were apparently taking no more interest in the outcome of the game. Alone stood young Jack, hollow-eyed and defiant.
"He means to play it alone," said the professor. "I do not believe that it is against the rules."
"By no means," said O'Malley. "A man could take on a regiment, should he so choose. As a bookmaker, I find such a confrontation interesting, to say the least." The Swan's patrons found it similarly so, and O'Malley was forced to open book upon his shirt sleeves. Young Jack took the mat. He gave the professor never a glance as he threw his Stygian arrows. To say that he actually threw them, however, would be to give a false account of the matter, for at one moment the darts were in his hand, and in another, or possibly the same, they were plastered into the darts board. No one saw them leave nor enter, but all agreed that the score was an unbeatable multiple of 20.
180,
came a whispered voice. Norman stepped to the fore. Although unnoticed by the throng, his darts now gave off an electrical discharge which disabled television sets 3 streets away and spoiled telephonic communications a mile off.
100
"480," came a still small voice when he had done his business. Young Jack strode once more into the fray. His eyes shone like a pair of Cortina reversing lamps, and a faint yellow fog rose from the corners of his mouth. He turned his head upon its axis and grinned back over his shoulders at the hushed crowd. With hardly a glance towards the board, he flung his darts. The outcome was a matter for the Guinness Book of Records to take up at a later date. "I don't like this," said Professor Slocum. "I'm missing something, but I do not know what it is." "We're scoring equal," said O'Malley. "He needs but one unfortunate error." "I'm loath to intervene, John." "It can make you desperate, Professor. Say a whole few words in the old tongue. Just be on the safe side." "We will wait a bit and see." "He's closing toward the kill," said John. Professor Slocum shook his head. "I still cannot see it. He appears to be winning by skill alone." "God bless him," said Pooley. O'Malley raised a fist towards his companion. "We are talking about the Swan's trophy here," he said, waggling the terror weapon towards Pooley. "This is no joke." "One day," said Jim calmly, "I shall turn like the proverbial worm and take terrible retribution upon you, O'Malley, for all the blows you have administered to my dear Ed." "Shh!" went at least a dozen patrons. "Uncle Teddy's up." Uncle Ted, Brentford's jovial greengrocer, was possibly the most loved man in the entire district. His ready smile and merry wit, his recourse to 1,000 cheersome and altruistic bon mot of the laugh and the world laughs with you, snores and you sleep alone variety, brought joy into the lives of even the most manic of depressives. It was said that he could turn a funeral procession into a conga line, and although there is no evidence to show that he ever took advantage of this particular gift, he was never short of a jocular quip or two as he slipped a few duff sprouts into a customer's carrier bag. O'Malley, who could not find it within himself to trust any man who would actually deal in, let alone handle a sprout, found the greengrocer nauseous to the extreme degree. "That smile could make a Samaritan commit suicide," he said. Uncle Ted did a little limbering up knee work, made flexing motions with his shoulders, and held a wet finger into the air. "Is the wind behind us?" he asked, amidst much laughter from his supporters. He waved at the smoke-filled air with a beer mat. "Which way's the boat, then? Anybody got a touch?" O'Malley groaned deeply within the folds of his beard. "Get on with it, you twerp," he muttered. Uncle Ted, who for all his inane clowning, was well aware that a wrong move now could cost him his livelihood. He took a careful aim, whose caution was disguised behind a bout of bum-wriggling. His first dart creased into the treble 20 with very little to spare. "Where did it land, then?" he asked, cupping his hand to his forehead and squinting about. His supporters nudged one another, cheered and guffawed. "What good lad," they said. "Get out, Uncle Ted." Ted looked towards the board and made a face of surprise upon sighting his dart. "Who threw that?" he asked. To cut a long and very tedious story short, Uncle Ted's second dart joined its fellow in the treble 20, but his third, however, had ideas of its own, and fastened its nose into the dreaded single one. The laughter and applause which followed this untimely blunder rang clearly and loudly, but not from any of those present who favoured the home team. "What a good lad," said young Jack. "Good old Uncle Ted." The greengrocer left the Flying Swan that night in disgrace. Some say that, like Judas, he went forth and hanged himself. Others, who are better informed, say that he moved to Chiswick, where he now owns 3 shops and spends 6 months of the year abroad. O'Malley was leafing frantically through the pages of his book. "I'm in big stuck here," he said suddenly, brushing away a bead of perspiration from his brow. "In my haste to accept bets on my certainty of the Swan's ultimate victory, I have somewhat miscalculated. The fix is in and ruination is staring me in the beard." Professor Slocum took the book from O'Malley's trembling fingers and examined it with care. "I spy a little circle of treachery here," he said. "The full horseman needs 141, gasped the adjudicator. "I finished," said O'Malley. "It's back to the old country for me. A boat at the dock and before the night is out." Professor Slocum was staring at the dartboard and shaking his head, his face wearing an unreadable expression. Pooley was ashen and speechless, but for the occasional patoo to the rear of the crowd, the Swan was a vacuum of utter silence. Young Jack squared up to the board as O'Malley hid his face in his hands and said a number of Hail Marys. Jack's first dart pierced the treble 20, his second a double, and his third the single 1. 101, mouthed the adjudicator in a manner which was perfectly understood by all deaf mutes present.
O'Malley waved away a later punter, proffering a wad of notes. "Away tonight with you," was all he could say. The adjudicator retired to the bar. He would say no more this evening, and would in all probability make himself known for the rest of his life through the medium of notepad and pencil. Norman, who had sacked the rest of the team, took the floor. He threw another blinding 180, but it really didn't seem to matter anymore. The 4 horsemen needed but a double top to take the shield, and a child of 3, or at a pinch 4 if he was born in Brentford, could surely have got that given 3 darts. Neville put the towels up and climbed onto the bar counter, knobkerrie in hand. There was very likely to be a good deal of death and destruction within another minute or 2, and he meant to be a survivor at any cost. Croughton, the pot-belly potman, leant back in his beer crate refuge and puffed upon his cigarette. Up above, the night stars glittered eternally, and nothing there presaged the doom and desolation which was about to befall Brentford. "Oh, look," he said suddenly to himself, as he peered up at the firmament. "Shooting stars. That's lucky. I shall make a wish on them." Upon the allotment a tiny figure moved. He was ill-washed and stubble-chinned, and he muttered beneath his breath. At intervals he raised his head and called, "Edgar!" No reply came, and he continued upon his journey, driven by a compulsion impossible to resist. "For roast mid to fry," said some drunken good-time Charlie, who had no idea of the gravity of the situation. "The full roastman needs 40. Young Jack peered from the crowd, wielding the dreaded darts. He crossed the floor and approached the professor. "You will not enjoy this, Saint Germain," he spat. "Be advised that I know you for what you are, and accept your defeat like the gentleman you are not." Professor Slocum was unmoved, his glittering eyes fixed upon young Jack. "If you want this to be sport," said he, "then so be it. If, however, you crave something more, then know that I am equal to the challenge." "Do your worst," sneered young Jack, now all bluster and bravado. "I am master of you." "So be it," said Professor Slocum. Young Jack took the ocky. Again his head turned 180 degrees upon his neck, and he gazed at the crowd. "The swan needs finished," he announced. 5 years have passed, and you've grown weak and complacent. Prepare to batter superior force. Say goodbye to your trophy, you suckers. A murderous rumble rolled through the crowd of home team supporters. There was a great stamping of feet and squaring of shoulders. Ties were being slackened and top buttons undone. Cufflinks were being removed and dropped into inside pockets. Young Jack raised his dart and lined up for a winner. Neville took a sharper hold on his knobkerrie and patted at his loins to ensure that the cricketer's box he had had the foresight to have for the occasion was in place. O'Malley smote the professor. "Save us, old man," he implored. "I will apologise later." Professor Slocum rose upon his cane and stared at his adversary. Young Jack drew back his hand and flung his dart. The thing creased the air at speed, then suddenly slowed. To the utter dumbfoundment of the crowd, it hung suspended in time and space exactly 6 feet 3 inches above the carpet and 5 feet from the board. Professor Slocum concentrated his gaze. Young Jack did likewise. The dart moved forward a couple of inches, then stopped once more and took a twitch backwards. The crowd were awestruck. Neville's knobkerrie hung loose in his hand. Great forces were at work here, great forces that he would rather have no part in, but he was here at the killing, and as part-time barman would do little other than offer support. Every eye, apart from one ill-matched pair, was upon that dart. Supporters of both swan and horseman alike wrinkled their brows and strained their brains upon that dart. Beads of perspiration appeared aplenty and fell, ruining many a good pint. The dart eased forward another 6 inches. Professor Slocum turned his stare towards the glowing red eyes of his opponent. The dart retreated. Young Jack drew a deep breath, and the dart edged once more towards its target. "You wouldn't get this on the telly," whispered Jim Pooley. Old Jack suddenly put his wrinkled hands to the wheels of his chair and propelled himself towards the professor. "Restrain that man!" yelled O'Malley. Pooley lurched from his seat, but in his haste to halt the wheeling ancient, caught his foot upon a chair leg and tripped. He clutched at the table, overturning it, and blundered into Professor Slocum, propelling him into the crowd. At this moment of truth, the now legendary all hell was let loose. The night-black dart set forth once more upon its journey and thundered towards the board. Young Jack stood grinning as Pooley upset his infirm father and brought down at least another 4 people in his desperation. O'Malley struggled up and struck the nearest man a vicious blow to the skull. Before the eyes of those stunned patrons who were not yet engaged in the fracas, the dart struck the board. As it did so, a devastating explosion occurred overhead, which shattered the bar optics, brought down great lumps of plaster from the ceiling, and upset the part-time barman into the crowd. "It is God!" shouted O'Malley, hitting with a will. "He will stand no more." Nicholas Roger Raffles Rathbone fell away from the Captain Laser machine. "It wasn't me," he whimpered. "I didn't do it." The lights of the Swan suddenly dimmed as the entire world, which was Brentford, proper went mad. "It wasn't me. It wasn't me, I swear it." Nobody really cared. Outside, something terrific was happening. Possibly it was the prelude to the long-awaited Armageddon, possibly earthquake or tidal wave. Whatever it was, the darts fans were not going to be caught napping, and the stampede towards the door was all-consuming. A single darkly clad figure, wearing a brand of creosote aftershave, was immediately trampled to oblivion beneath the rush. As the patrons poured into the night, the enormity of what had occurred became apparent. Shards of flaming metal were hurtling down upon Brentford. Great sheets of fire were rising from the tarmac of the Ealing Road as the surface met each blazing assault. Several front gardens were ablaze. Pooley and O'Malley helped the fallen professor to his feet. "It has begun," said John. "What do we do?" "To the machine," yelled the old man. "It would appear that Norman has served us well." Nicholas Roger Raffles Rathbone stood blankly staring at the screen. "I didn't do it," he said repeatedly. O'Malley was at his side in an instant. "Play it!" he roared. "You heard the kiddie! Play it!" Rathbone drew back in horror. "No!" he shouted. "Something is wrong. I will have no part of it." "Play it!" O'Malley grabbed at green hair and drew the stinker close to the machine. "You are the unbeatable master. Play it!" Nick drew up his head in a gesture of defiance. As he did so, he stumbled upon a chunk of fallen ceiling and fell backwards, leaving O'Malley clutching a bundle of green hair and what appeared to be a latex rubber face mask. The figure that collapsed to the Swan's floor, now bereft of his disguise, resembled nothing more or less than a young Jack Palance. "He's one of them!" screamed O'Malley, pointing to the fallen Syrian and dancing dementedly. "He was never playing the machine. He was signalling with it. Get him! Get him!" Pooley hastened to oblige. "The left armpit, isn't it?" he growled. The erstwhile paperboy backed away, covering his wedding tackle. "Not the armpit," he whimpered. "Anything but the armpit." Professor Slocum was at the machine. "How does it work?" he cried. "How does it work?" "Leave him, Jim!" yelled O'Malley. "Play the machine, Pooley! Shoot the bastards down!" Upon the allotments, columns of pure white light were rising into the sky. The door of Soap Distance Hut was wide open, and a great glow poured from it, silhouetting dozens of identical figures gliding through the opening. When the first great explosion occurred, a small dwarf in a soiled postman's suit had flattened himself into a sprout bed, but now he arose to his full height and stared about in horror at the bizarre spectacle. He bobbed up and down and flapped his arms. "Edgar!" he shouted. "Edgar, help me! Help me!" The figures now pouring through the shed doorway were bearing down upon him, and the postman took to his tiny heels and fled. He plunged through the open allotment gates and paused only to assure himself that he still had a tight hold upon a pair of bolt cutters he had been carrying. Without further ado, he continued his journey, bound for a certain lock-up garage upon the Butts estate, and destiny. In the Swan, Pooley was at the controls. "There's 8 of them," he said, moving in a V formation. His finger rattled upon the neutron bomb release button, and tiny beads of yellow light swept upwards towards the bobbing cones at the top of the screen. "Get them, Jim!" screamed O'Malley. "Come on now! You know it's done!" "I'm trying, aren't I? Get us a drink, for God's sake." Neville, who had fallen rather heavily, but happily not upon his tender parts, was on all fours in the middle of the floor. "What the hell's going on?" he gasped. "Get away from the counter, O'Malley." "We're breaking your machine," said the breathless Irishman. "But what was that explosion? Oh my God!" Neville pointed through the Swan's front windows. "Half the Ealing Road's on fire. Call the appliances." Pooley bashed at the button with his fist and jumped up and down. I've got one! I've got one!" Overhead, but a little less loudly this time, there was another explosion, followed by the sound of faltering engines and a Messerschmitt dive from a scream. Those present at the Swan ducked their heads as something thundered by at close quarters and whistled away into the distance. There was a moment's deadly silence, followed by a muted but obviously powerful report. Another Syrian craft had fallen to earth upon Brentford. Given its point of impact, it was unlikely that Jim Pooley would ever again receive a threatening letter regarding an overdue library book.
There, there! Neville was pointing and ranting. It's the Third World War, and never got the 4-minute warning. I am withholding my vote at the next election. Small Dave struggled up from the gutter and shrieked with pain. He had been rather nearer to the library's destruction, and a sliver of shrapnel from the founder's plaque had caught him on the backside. "Oh, whoa, 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 oh, damn!" he wailed. A less determined man would by now have called it a day and dived for the nearest foxhole, but loathing and hatred overwhelmed the postman, and nothing would turn him from his vendetta. Feeling tenderly at his bleeding bum, he raised the bolt cutter to the garage lock and applied all his strength. He strained and sweated as he fought with the steel clasp. Finally, with a sickening crunch, the metal gave and the garage door swung upwards. Small Dave stood panting in the opening, his features shining pinkly by the light of 10,000 blazing dog-eared library books. Sweat poured from his face as he surveyed the object of his quest. Snorting and wriggling in the eaves of the lock-up garage was Simon, a camel far from home. "Now that you have it," said a voice which loosened Small Dave's bowels, "what are you going to do with it?" The postman swung upon his Blakeys. "Edgar," he said, "where in the holy place have you been?" Norman had been almost the first man out of the Swan. As the explosion rang in his ears, he had realised that big trouble was in store, and that if he was to take his great quest to its ultimate conclusion, now was going to have to be the time. Clutching his purloined microcircuit to his bosom, he braved the rain of fire and legged it back to his shop and his workroom. Now, as the explosions came thick and fast from all points of the compass, he fiddled with the screwdriver and slotted the thing into place. "Power inductor," he said to himself. "We channel the power from miles around directly into the apparatus. Wonderful, wonderful." Norman threw the much-loved "We Belong Dead" switch, and his equipment sprang into life. In the Swan, the lights momentarily dimmed. "Another power cut," groaned Neville. "All I ruddy need, another power cut. Typical it is, ruddy typical." Pooley thundered away at the machine, watched by the Professor and John O'Malley, who was feeding the lad with scotch. "Go to it, Jem!" O'Malley bashed Pooley repeatedly on the back. "You've got them on the run. There, you missed that one. Pay attention, will you?" Pooley laboured away beneath the Irishman's assault. "Lay off me, John," he implored. "They're firing back. Look at that." The skyline upon the screen had suddenly been translated into that of the immediate area. The silhouettes of the flat blocks and the gasometer were now clearly visible. As the three men stared in wonder, a shower of sparks descended upon the screen from one of the skirting craft and struck the silhouette. Outside, a great roar signalled the demolition of one of the flat blocks. "Get them, you fool! Get them!" Unnoticed, Raffles Rathbone edged towards the door and slipped through it, having it hastily away upon his toes towards the allotments. The Swan's lights dimmed once more. In Norman's kitchenette, lights were flashing, and a haze of smoke was rising from many a dodgy spot weld. Norman sat on his console, punching coordinates into his computer, an ever-increasing hum informing him that the equipment was warming up nicely. Clinging to the controls of a not altogether dissimilar console was a swarthy clone of a famous film star. Lombard Omega had taken the controls. "Treachery!" he spat from between his gritted and expensively capped teeth. "Treachery! Those bastards have drawn us into a trap. Bloody change of government. I shouldn't wonder. How many ships lost, Mr. Navigator?" The navigator shrank low over its guidance systems. "4 now, sir," he said. "No, make that 5. Take us out of autopilot then. I shall fly this whopping thing manually." One of the remaining blips vanished from the video screen of the Captain Laser alien attack machine. "Oh dear," said the Professor. "It had occurred to me they might just catch on." "There's still another 2, said O'Malley. "Get them! Get them!" There was now a good deal of Brentford which was only memory. The new inn had gone, along with the library, and one of the gasometers was engulfed in flame. A falling craft had cut Uncle Ted's greengrocery business cleanly out of the Ealing Road, which, survivors of the Holocaust who favoured that flying swan were later to remark, was about the only good thing to come out of the whole affair. There had miraculously been no loss of life, possibly because Brentford boasts more well-stocked Anderson shelters per square mile than any other district in London, but probably because this is not that kind of book. Pooley was faltering in his attack. "My right arm's gone," moaned he, "and my bomb-release button finger's got the cramp. I can play no more." O'Malley struck his companion the now notorious blow to the skull. "That does it." Pooley turned upon O'Malley. "When trouble threatens, strike Jim Pooley. I will have no more." Pooley threw a suddenly uncramped fist towards O'Malley's chin. By virtue of its unexpected nature and unerring accuracy, he floored the Irishman for a good deal more than the count of 10.
Professor Slocum looked down at the unconscious figure beneath the beard.
If that score is settled, I would appreciate it if you'd apply yourself once more to the machine before the other two craft catch wind of what is going on and switch to manual override.
Quite so, said Pooley, spitting upon his palms and stepping once more to the video screen. Small Dave backed away from Edgar Allan Poe, his tiny hands a flapping blur.
"Why do this?" he demanded. "I don't like the look of you one bit."
The Victorian author approached upon silent, transparent feet. "You conjured me here," he said, "and I came willingly, thinking you to be a disciple, but now I found I'm drawn into a position from which I am unable to extricate myself, that I must serve you. That cannot be."
"So leave it then," whined Small Dave. "I meant no offence to you, I only wanted a little assistance. You realise who I am? I am Poe, the master of terror, the greatest novelist ever to live. Poe, the creator of Japan, the world's original consulting detective. Japan, who was not, I repeat, not a dwarf. You involve one such as myself in your trivial vendettas. I have spoken with Professor Slocum. There is only one way I can find release, you vindictive, grudge-bearing wee bastard."
Small Dave backed towards the floating camel. Simon was floundering amongst the rafters, bawling now at the top of his voice, loosening slates and splintering woodwork.
"Stay away from me!"
shrieked Small Dave.
"Stay away from me!"
shrieked Simon, in fluent dromedary. Edgar Allan Poe stalked onwards, his patent leather pumps raising dust upon another plane, but leaving no footprint upon the earth.
"Stay away from me!"
Simon gave a great lurch and burst out of the rafters of the lock-up garage. As he rose through the shattered opening towards the stars, Edgar Allan Poe lunged forward and, in a single movement, bound the trailing halter line firmly about Small Dave's waist. Wailed the dwarf as he was dragged from his feet to follow the wayward camel through the open roof. Edgar Allan Poe watched them go. "I will be off now," he said, and like Small Dave, he was. In Norman's kitchenette, all sorts of exciting things were happening. Dials were registering overload to all points of the compass, lights were flashing and buzzers buzzing. The great brain-hammering hum had reached deafening point, and a hideous pressure filled the room, driving Norman's head down between his shoulder blades and bursting every Corona bottle upon his shop shelves. With superhuman effort, he thumped another fistful of switches, clasped his hands across his ears, and sank to the floor. Every light in Brentford, Chiswick, Hounslow, Ealing, Kew, and for some reason Penge, went out. Lombard Omega squinted through a porthole.
"Black out," he growled. "Rustling black out, the willy flagslaws, Mr. Navigator. How many of us left?"
The navigator looked up from his controls.
"We are it,"
he said. What Lombard Omega had to say about that cannot possibly be recorded. It must, however, be clearly stated in his defence that it was one of his ancestors who had invented the Anglo-Saxon tongue.
"Take us in low," he said. "We will strafe out the entire area. Stand by at the neutron bomb bays and make ready the gamma weapon."
"Not the gamma weapon," said all those present.
"The gamma weapon? Scroll-free," said the navigator.
Pooley, Neville and Professor Slocum peered around in the darkness. The only light available flickered through the Swan's front windows from a roaring inferno, which had once been much of Brentford. "What now?" Pooley asked. The Professor shook his head.
"You've done it! You've done it! Crack the champagne!"
Neville performed a high-stepping dance before the now darkened and obviously defunct Captain Lear's alien attack machine.
"Free beer for a year,"
moaned a voice from the deck.
"For a century," sang Neville. "Oh, bliss, oh, heaven, oh, no!"
From the distance came a faint whine of unearthly engines. Something large and deadly was approaching, and all means of confounding its destructive intent had vanished away.
"Oh dear," said Professor Slocum. "Anybody care for the last rites?" "Prepare the gamma weapon," ordered Lombard Omega. "Gamma weapon prepared, sir. Take out the entire quadrant. Spare not an inch. Not an inch, sir. Fire the gamma weapon."
The navigator flinched and touched a lighted panel upon the master console. A broad beam of red raw energy leapt down from beneath the ship and struck home upon the Kew side of the River Thames. The 500-year-old orcs of the Royal Botanic Gardens took fire, and half a millennium of history melted away in a single moment. The beam extended over a wider area and tore into the river. The waters thrashed and boiled like a witch's cauldron, hissed and frothed beneath the unstoppable power of the deadly gamma weapon, and the beam moved forward. The mothership ground on over the river, a vast chromium blimp filling a quarter of the sky. Along the length of its mirrored sides, lights glittered and twinkled like oil beads. Above it, great dorsal spines rose shark-like and menacing. The hideous beam moved up from the churning waters and ripped into the riverbank, hewing out a broad and ragged channel into which the old Thames gushed in a billowing flood tide. Ahead lay the Brentford quadrant, the Ealing Road and the Flying Swan. Brentonians fled from their shelters out into the streets. They shielded their faces against the all-consuming heat and took to their heels. The world was coming to an end, and now was not the time to take the old Lot's wife backward glance. In the Swan, the lads cowered in terror as the ghastly rumble of falling masonry and the death cry of splintering glass drew ever nearer. Outside, the Ealing Road crammed with screaming humanity, pouring and tumbling in a mad lemming dash away from the approaching Holocaust. Behind them, the blinding red wall of fire pressed on, destroying everything which lay in its path. O'Malley was upon his knees. "Stop it!" he screamed at Professor Slocum. "Do something! In the name of our God! Only you can!" The Professor stood immobile. The cries of terror rang in his ears and stung at his soul. The town he had so for very long cared for and protected was being razed to ashes, and he was powerless to stop it. He turned a compassionate face towards the Irishman, and tears welled in his eyes. "What can I do?" he asked in a choked voice. "I'm truly sorry, John." Lombard Omega stared down upon the carnage with a face of hatred and contempt. "Run, you lost spirits!" he shouted, as the ant-like figures beneath scattered in all directions. "I will have every last one of you. Look at that! Look at that!" The crew of the mothership craned their necks to the portholes. Below, the destruction was savage and sickening. The streets were being cleaved apart, the houses and shops, flat blocks and places of worship driven from existence. More than 30 Morris miners, some even priceless collector's models with split windscreens, suicide doors and hand-clapped wiper arms, had already been atomized, never again to sneak through the dodgy back street MOT. Professor Slocum closed his hands in prayer. As the wall of fire moved relentlessly forward and the buildings fell into twisted ruination, he knew that only a miracle could save Brentford. "What's that, sir?" asked the Syrian deckhand, pointing through a porthole. "What's what?" "That, sir." Lombard Omega strained his eyes through the rising smoke screen of burning Brentford. He screamed, catching sight of a floating object directly in the ship's path. "It's a clocking camel! Hard to port! Hard to port!" "You are at the controls," the cringing navigator informed his captain. Lombard swung the wheel and the craft veered sharply to the left, avoiding the drifting Simon by a hair-breadth. Caught in the slipstream, a certain small portsman let fly with a volley of obscenity which would have caused even the ship's captain to blush. "That was stabbing close," said Lombard Omega, wiping creosote from his brow. "Those blabbers don't miss a trick, do they? A slowing camel could have messed up the windscreen. Give me more power, Mr. Navigator. More power!" The navigator upped the ante and covered his eyes. A great vibration filled the air, a fearsome pressure driving everything downwards. The floodwaters ceased their frenzied rush and hung suspended, as if touched by Moses' staff. The scattering Brentonians tumbled away to the pavements, gasping at the superheated air and clutching at their throats. The Captain Laser alien attack machine lurched from its mountings and toppled into the Swan, bringing down the side wall and exposing the horrors of Archie Karachi's kitchen to Neville, who, borne by the terrible force, vanished backwards over the bar counter, losing the last of his fillings. As Pooley and O'Malley struck the siggy-scarred carpet, their last glimpse of anything approaching reality was of Professor Slocum. The old man stood, the hellfire painting his ancient features, hands raised towards the burning sky, now visible through the Swan's shattered roof, his mouth reciting the syllables of a ritual which was old before the dawn of recorded history. Above came the deadly whine of engines as Lombard Omega and the crew of the starship Sandra moved in for the kill. "Finish them!" screamed the captain. "Finish them!" The ship rocked and shivered. Needles upon 1,000 crystal dials rattled into the danger zone. A low pulsating hum set the captain's teeth on edge and caused the navigator, who had suddenly found Christianity, to cross himself. Screamed Lombard. The ship's engines coughed and faltered. The air about the craft ionized as a vague image of something monstrous swam into view. It wavered, half-formed and transparent, and then, amid a great maelstrom of tearing elements, became solid. Lombard Omega stared in horror through the forward port. "What's that?" he cried, drawing up his hands. "What in the name of—" His final words, however obscene, must remain unrecorded, for at one moment he was steering his craft through empty air above Brentford football ground, and at the next it was making violent and irreconcilable contact with the capping stone of the Great Pyramid of Chops. Whoosh, wham, crash, and pooh went the starship Sandra, as it lost a goodly amount of its undercarriage and slewed to one side. It plummeted downwards, a screaming ball of fire, narrowly missing the roof of the Flying Swan, cartwheeled over the piano museum, and tore down towards the allotments. The last men of Ceres, who were standing around looking rather bemused, a very great deal of carefully laid explosive, and a few sparse and dismal remnants of a former postman's prize-winning cabbage patch. There was a moment of terrible silence, and then an explosion which rocked the seismographs at Greenwich, and had the warlords of a dozen nations reaching towards the panic buttons. A very great silence then fell upon what was left of the Brentford Triangle. Epilogue. The sun rose the next morning at 3 a.m. This came as a great surprise to those folk of Brentford who felt in the mood to enjoy the dawn chorus, but no more so than it did to the peoples of the Nile Delta who, somewhat bewildered at the sudden disappearance of their greatest tourist attraction, also noticed that the nights were definitely drawing in a bit. Had the Memorial Library clock been still extant, it would have just struck the hour when an impossibly long blow-loader turned up at the Ealing Road, demolishing Brentford's 2 remaining lamp-posts and cracking 100 paving stones beneath its many-wheeled assault. High in the cab, illuminated by the green dashlights and the first rays of the rising sun, sat a bald-headed man in a saffron robe. He puffed upon a woodbine and stared through the tinted windscreen at the blackened wreckage which had once been the town of his birth. There had been more than a few changes while he had been away. This was clear. Another council housing project, he assumed, or road-widening scheme, although it appeared a little drastic. He pulled the 500-foot vehicle up through the gears and rolled it over the railway bridge, whose girders groaned beneath the strain. Where had the new inn gone? And surely the council would not have demolished 2 of their cherished flat blocks. The great vehicle's front wheels plunged into a bomb crater, dislodging the driver's woodbine into his lap. He would have harsh words to say about all this enormous mistake. Here he was, delivering the greatest archaeological discovery in the history of mankind, and they'd let the road go to ruin. And what, in Count Dante's name, was that? Artroy brought the mammoth loader to a shuddering halt. Retrieving his fallen woodbine, he climbed down from the cab, and in considerable awe he stared up at the vast structure which now stood upon the site formerly occupied by Brentford's football ground. That was the Great Pyramid of Giza, or he was a clog-dancing Dutchman. The man of bronze ground out his cigarette with a naked heel and scratched at his hairless pate. Whatever had been going on around here? He climbed back into his cab and put the mighty vehicle into gear. He was rapidly losing his temper. Where was the reception committee? Where was the bunting and the mayor? Had he not written to Neville detailing the time of his arrival? This was all a bit much. Ahead, in the distance, faint lights showed in a window. The Flying Swan, surely. But candlelit? Artroy applied the brakes and brought the low loader to a standstill outside the smoke-blackened and shrapnel-pocked drinking house. He fumbled at his dashboard for another packet of cigarettes, but could find nothing but a bundle of picture postcards displaying now inaccurate rooftop views of Brentford. He climbed down from his cab. Sam shut the door, and kicking rubble to left and right of him, strode across the road to the Swan's doorway. With a single curling backward kick, he applied his bare foot to the door, taking it from its hinges and propelling it forwards towards the bar. 4 startled men looked up in horror from their drinks at the bar counter. Jim Pooley, John O'Malley, Professor Slocum and Neville, the part-time barman. "Artroy!" gasped Neville, squinting towards a terrific figure framed in the Swan's doorway. "Artroy! Is that you?" Artroy fixed the part-time barman with a baleful eye. "I have the Ark of Noah,"
outside of my lorry," he said. "I don't suppose that any of you after-hours drinkers would care to step outside and give it the once-over?"
O'Malley struggled to his feet.
"Diac, no, I know it," he said. "Could I interest you at all in a guided tour around the Great Pyramid of Brentford?"
This has been The Brentford Triangle, the Brentford Trilogy, Book 2. If you enjoyed this series and like to hear more, please follow the channel and give us some support. If you want to be notified of when we put new chapters up or even the full book, please hit that notifications bell. As always, thank you for listening.